In the name of the Creator, the Christ, and the Holy Comforter. Amen. You may be seated. Today, my friends, around the world, millions of Christians gather just as we do. Jesus compels us to be gathered together on this most holy of days for the church. Time in which we celebrate, we remember Jesus' triumphing over death, his resurrection. And yet, in our gospel this morning, we don't meet the risen Jesus, do we? We do in other versions of this. We know how this story ends, but put yourselves into Mary and Mary Magdalene's and Salome's shoes. They don't know how this story ends yet. And so we enter into this narrative where they've come and they see Jesus is not in the tomb as they expected, but he's not there. And there's this young man cloaked in white who says, Jesus is alive. He goes ahead of you to Galilee. Go and share this good news. And what we end with is hearing about their terror and their fear, and they flee and say nothing to anyone. To me, I hear a paradox that we don't see in our gospel the resurrected Jesus here, and that our gospel ends unfinished. I wonder what happened in those moments, in those days after this gospel ends. Because the reality is, those women did say something. They did share the good news with the disciples. And they and the disciples went out into the wider world and spread the good news that Jesus had risen. And we have the evidence of it right here. The fact that we are in this space together as a community is testament that through their fear, they chose courage and they proclaimed something radical and new for this world. So what shifted for them? What empowered them, made them bold enough to let go of their fear and terror to speak the good news? I think, first, it is helpful to remember that Jesus and all of his disciples were nurtured by the Jewish faith, just as we are in our Hebrew scriptures. And in that moment in time when Mary and Mary Magdalene and Salome are trying to figure out what this means, they have in their hearts and in their memories all the times where there was fear and terror before and where God saw them through it. For them, they can recall how God led the people of Israel out of Egypt, led them out of slavery and bondage to a new land. They can remember how it was to Abraham and Sarah that God said, "Follow me, and I will create of you a beautiful nation." It's the same promise that God offers also to Hagar and her son Ishmael in the wilderness. When she fears that her child's life is at an end, God says, "I will make a great nation of him." When we think over and over again about the different moments in our scriptures, our memory, our lived histories, we can see where even in the darkest shadows, in the scariest of moments, God never abandoned creation. God never abandoned us. And in their minds too, for Mary Magdalene, and Salome, in the midst of this fear, they have their experiences with Jesus. They know of how their lives were changed by him, how his love nurtured and healed them, how his invitation to others drew together this odd, motley assortment of sinners and prostitutes and Pharisees and rabbis and tax collectors and people who hadn't been able to walk for years. They watched Jesus make the lame to walk, the blind to see, the deaf to hear. They were able to witness how Jesus turned water into wine, how he took a few loaves of bread and fishes and fed thousands. And perhaps also in their lived memory, more recently so, was recalling the few days prior when Jesus himself collapsed to his knees in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he prayed to God, and it's recorded in our scriptures that he was afraid. Jesus had fear in his heart too. And yet, in that space, Jesus did not stay in his fear. He did not stay shackled to that grieving. He said, Lord, not my will, but yours. Yes, when I think about these women and how they were processing their fear, I ponder if they thought about Jesus and how he moved through his fear, knowing it would take him to death. And yet here we are on the third day, and Jesus is alive? The paradox of our faith. I ponder what that revealed to them in their fear, knowing that Jesus went ahead of them and conquered something that never seemed conquerable before. I wonder maybe how our own fear and uncertainty and confusion interacts with the resurrection. I wonder how we too, in this world, are seeking for a new way, are seeking to be set free, liberated from the pains of our living, the injustices of the world. I wonder how we too find our fear in the fear of these faithful women. And this is where we begin to find our hope. Because again, Jesus didn't stay in that fear, didn't stay in the grief. Jesus moved forward. He walked forward, trusting that God would see him through it. And God did. Jesus died on a cross and then rose again 3 days later so that we might know that even there, even in the finality of death, God's love reigns. God's love frees all creation. And it frees us from feeling that we walk this road alone. The young man in the tomb says, Jesus goes ahead of you. He points to something that these women would have remembered just a few days before when Jesus said, I go before you to prepare a place for you. Jesus didn't go to abandon us. Jesus went so that when we went to, God would be there with us. So that we would know whatever fear we face, God will meet us on the other side of it, and that God will journey through it with us. It doesn't erase the fact that we will have fear and uncertainty, but it erases that idea that there is death on the other side of it. There is life, there is goodness, there is resurrection. And so what does this mean for us? I hear in the invitation that the young man gives to these women to go and follow Jesus, how it's also an invitation for ourselves. And my friends, it is so important for the world today. The world is in need of the gospel, of the good news, to know the power of what happened on that morning so long ago. Now let me be clear here. When we say to follow, when we say to share the good news, I'm not talking about proselytizing. I'm not asking anyone to go out on a street corner and bang someone over the head with the Bible and say, you have to believe my way or else. That is not what is being said here. The invitation is for us to go out and proclaim the hope that is in our hearts, to speak how we have known healing because of Christ's presence in our life, to name how our lives have changed, and because we changed, how we've been in the world has changed, and how that actually changes things in the world. It's faithful proclaiming of the gospel looks like those of us who are in boardrooms or spaces where big decisions are made, and raising our hand and saying, is this just what we're doing? Is this loving? Will this build community or will it tear it down? Perhaps faithful proclamation looks like in your classrooms or on our school buses, and we see someone bullied and tormented and picked on, and we come forward and we stand beside them, we support them, we tell them that they are loved and that they are not alone. We stand in solidarity with the oppressed and the weak and the attacked. What about in our everyday life when we have so much that we could be angry at and so many people that we could judge and be frustrated with, but each moment that we choose to respond in love, in grace, to hold space for people so that they might be able to name their pain, so that poison is drawn out. My friends, this is how we share the good news. It is not about converting people. Only God can convert hearts. It's about proclaiming the hope that we have experienced. It's about living that hope out and sharing that love unconditionally, and doing so without fear of death. It doesn't mean it won't be scary. It doesn't mean it won't require vulnerability. But we can do it because God has gone before us. Jesus has made a way where there wasn't a way. God has always done. And we are invited with those 3 women on that first Easter morn to decide, will we remain shackled and imprisoned by our fears and doubts and uncertainties, our old way of life, or will we choose to follow the God who goes ahead of us, who goes with us, who shows us that even death doesn't have power over God or God's people? So I leave us with that question. Will we follow Jesus who goes ahead? Will we walk out of the tombs in which we are buried and follow the life of the world? Amen.